The lights dimmed at the Venice International Film Festival, and as the final credits began to roll on The Smashing Machine, something unprecedented happened. Before the credits could even finish, the Sala Grande erupted into thunderous applause that would last exactly 15 minutes and 30 seconds. In that darkened theater, Dwayne Johnson, Hollywood's most recognizable face, sat crying beside Mark Kerr, the broken fighter whose life he had just portrayed with such devastating authenticity that even he was unrecognizable under 22 individual prosthetics. It was the most paradoxical moment of Johnson's career, the world's biggest movie star achieving his greatest artistic triumph by becoming completely invisible. For over 2 decades, Johnson had been engaged in an exhausting performance of authenticity, a carefully choreographed dance between his wrestling persona, The Rock, and his aspirational image as Hollywood's hardest-working family man. Yet in that Venice theater, stripped of his trademark smile and buried under layers of prosthetic muscle, scars, and damaged flesh, he had finally found what had eluded him throughout his meteoric rise: genuine artistic respect. The journey to that moment reveals everything wrong with modern celebrity authenticity and the prison that Johnson had unknowingly built for himself. Brick by brick, smile by smile, the conditioning begins. Vince and the company always told me, "Hey, you can't smile enough," Johnson revealed in a rare moment of vulnerability. "You go out, you smile? I want to make sure everybody knows you're grateful." Even when 20,000 fans chanted "Rocky sucks" during his early WWE days, the directive remained unchanged. The bosses were telling me, "No, you got to smile. Ignore it. Just ignore it." This wasn't just wrestling advice, it was psychological conditioning that would define Johnson's relationship with authenticity for the next 25 years. He learned to perform gratitude even when humiliated, to project strength even when vulnerable, and to maintain an unbreakable facade even when everything inside was crumbling. The muscle memory of that smile became so ingrained that it survived his transition to Hollywood, evolving into the perpetually positive social media presence, the motivational 4 a.m. workout videos, the carefully curated image of a man who had transcended human limitations through sheer force of will. The authenticity trap. As Johnson's star rose, so did the stakes of maintaining his image. Each Instagram post was scrutinized for authenticity. Each public appearance was an opportunity to prove he remained grounded despite astronomical success. Each interview became a performance of humility that felt increasingly hollow. The trap was insidious. The more Johnson tried to appear authentic, the more manufactured he became. The 4 a.m. workout posts, the inspirational captions, the strategic vulnerability. All of it began to feel like content strategy rather than genuine sharing. His conversation with Brendan Fraser reveals the psychological toll. "When did you understand that you weren't allowed to show it?" Johnson asked his friend, unknowingly describing his own dilemma. Fraser's response was telling. "I was trying too hard. I was feeling like unless it hurts, then I'm not doing my job." The parallel was unmistakable. Both men had been trapped by their own success, forced to perform invincibility when what they needed was permission to be human. "There was about 22 prosthetics," he told Jimmy Fallon, his voice carrying a reverence typically reserved for sacred experiences. "I had to put on 30 pounds of muscle." Mark Kerr had this quality of muscle, like fast twitch quality muscle, because he was a wrestler. The physical transformation was secondary to the psychological liberation. Freed from the obligation to be recognizable, inspiring, or even likable, Johnson could finally access the vulnerability that had been conditioned out of him since his wrestling days. The Venice revelation, that 15.5-minute ovation, wasn't just applause for a performance. It was recognition of something the audience had never seen before: Dwayne Johnson as an actor rather than as a brand. The irony was profound. He had spent his entire career trying to be seen as authentic, only to achieve that authenticity by becoming invisible. "I was so happy for him, for Mark," Johnson said through tears, "because it was his validation that despite your struggles, despite the fact you overdosed twice and you're still here, he's lucky to be alive. Things turned out okay, and you are an inspiration to everybody." But the validation was as much Johnson's as it was Kerr's. For the first time since those early wrestling days when he was forced to smile through humiliation, Johnson had found a performance space where pretense wasn't required, where vulnerability was strength, and where disappearing completely had made him more visible than ever. The standing ovation represented something unprecedented in his career. Applause that wasn't for his brand, his physique, or his box office power, but for his willingness to surrender completely to someone else's story. The prison door opens. In that Venice theater, surrounded by industry peers who had watched him evolve from wrestler to movie star to corporate entity, Johnson experienced something he had been chasing for decades: artistic respect, untainted by commercial considerations. The 22 prosthetics had done what no amount of motivational content or carefully crafted authenticity could accomplish. They had set him free. The mask, ironically, had revealed the man underneath. The quest for authenticity that had trapped him in an exhausting performance of perfection had finally led him to a role where perfection wasn't the goal. Truth was. As the applause continued, Johnson sat next to Mark Kerr, both men crying for different reasons but sharing the same moment of recognition. Kerr was seeing his story honored. Johnson was discovering what it felt like to honor someone else's story completely, without ego or agenda. It took 22 prosthetics and complete invisibility for Hollywood's most visible star to finally, authentically disappear into his work. The mask that had become his prison had, in the end, become the key to his artistic freedom. The question now is whether Johnson can carry this hard-won authenticity back into a career built on the very artificiality he just transcended. Venice proved he's capable of profound artistic truth, but only when completely hidden from view. Perhaps that's the most honest thing about Dwayne Johnson. His truest self emerges only when he's allowed to stop being himself entirely. The weight of performance. The journey to Venice began in those early WWE days when a 25-year-old wrestler named Rocky Maivia was told to smile through 20,000 people chanting his failure. It continued through Hollywood's golden years when every public appearance required the performance of gratitude, every social media post needed to inspire millions. You realize that in life there's no one wants to lose, Johnson told Fraser during their intimate conversation. It's just pressure. This pressure to always be on, always be inspiring, always be the rock, had created a psychological prison where authenticity became performance. The man who built his brand on just being himself had forgotten who that self actually was. The Fraser Mirror. In Brendan Fraser, Johnson found someone who understood the specific torture of performing invincibility while feeling increasingly fragile inside. When you have to keep it together and not let anyone know until the whole house of cards falls apart, Fraser observed about Johnson's Venice performance. That was when I went, "Oh man, Dwayne, you've done it. You're here." Fraser had walked the path Johnson was discovering, the journey from performing strength to accessing genuine vulnerability. Fraser's Oscar win came from embracing complete breakdown in The Whale. I felt like what Smashing Machine represented for me was I'm living my dream. This is my dream, Johnson admitted. And not others' dreams. This distinction reveals the core tragedy of Johnson's career. For decades, he had been living the dreams others projected onto him. Studio executives, fans, social followers. The technology of disappearance. The 22 prosthetics weren't just makeup. They were a complete technological deconstruction of the Johnson brand. Each piece represented another layer of separation from the identity that had trapped him in perpetual performance. We had a physical transformation, and certainly an emotional transformation, and a vocal transformation too, Johnson explained, his voice carrying the wonder of someone who had discovered something new within himself. Kazuhiro's prosthetic work didn't just transform Johnson's appearance. It liberated him from the psychological burden of being recognizable. For the first time since his early wrestling days, he could fail, could be ugly, could show weakness. The detailed attention to Kerr's physicality reflects Johnson's complete submission to someone else's story. This wasn't The Rock plays Mark Kerr. This was Dwayne Johnson disappearing so thoroughly that Mark Kerr could exist authentically. The violence of truth. Benny Safdie's directive, as real as it gets, became the philosophical framework for Johnson's transformation. The violence required wasn't just physical, it was psychological. I said to our fighter, "You have to hit me," Johnson recalled. The insistence on real contact wasn't method acting. It was a man who had spent decades protecting himself, finally insisting on genuine consequence. So you'll see in the movie he's rocking me over and over and over again. That's because I had a concussion. The concussion becomes a metaphor. Johnson literally had to have his consciousness altered to access the performance Venice would celebrate. The mathematics of authenticity. 15 minutes and 30 seconds. In the calculus of Venice Film Festival standing ovations, this duration represented something unprecedented for Johnson. Applause that had nothing to do with his commercial value. I was looking through my phone at these other movies that are getting these standing ovations like 5 minutes and 6 minutes and 10 minutes, and I'm thinking, God, are we going to get a minute or anything? The self-doubt was genuine because for once the outcome wasn't guaranteed. This wasn't a Fast and Furious sequel where his star power could compensate for story weaknesses. This was pure acting, judged by the most sophisticated film audience in the world. When the applause finally came, it lasted longer than most Hollywood careers. That place, I have chills, erupted for 5.5 minutes, and before the credits even rolled and the lights come on and I'm crying. The liberation paradox. The deepest irony of Johnson's Venice triumph is that it required complete abandonment of everything that had made him successful. The smile that had carried him through WWE humiliation, the physicality that had made him an action star, the recognizable features that had made him a global brand, all of it had to be surgically removed. I realized that in that particular scene, it's what I feel like my life had come to, Johnson reflected. You realize that in life, there's no one wants to lose. This realization that the fear of losing had driven him to construct an identity incapable of genuine vulnerability represents the breakthrough that made the Venice moment possible. The prosthetics weren't just hiding his face, they were hiding the face he had learned to perform with. Under 22 pieces of artificial skin, bone, and scar tissue, Johnson finally found permission to be imperfect, to fail, to break down completely. The technology of transformation had become the technology of liberation. The standing ovation at Venice wasn't just recognition of a great performance. It was acknowledgement of a resurrection. The Dwayne Johnson who had been buried under brand management had clawed his way back to the surface.